Okay, we're looking at guided notes on complex numbers. I'm going to try to make this legible. Okay? Sometimes we encounter equations that have no real solutions, so we have to rely on a number system with imaginary units indicated by the letter I. We can take the square root of a positive number like 9. 9 equals 3 because 3 squared equals 9. Technically, the right answer is 3 and negative 3, correct? Mm-hmm. This is way blown out. So negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9, right? So the answer could be 3 or negative 3. That's why there's a plus or minus sign in the quadratic formula, okay? So how do we get negative 9? We can't. 3 times 3 is 9. Negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. So we call it I. I stands for the square root of negative 1. Now what if we had the square root of negative 1 squared? What do we get? So let's look at this. If we have the square root of negative 1 and we square it, what does that squared do? It gets rid of the square root, right? So then we are just left with negative 1. You know, like if we have the square root of x and we square it, we end up just with x, right? So when we take the square root of the squared of the square root, we just get negative 1. So what we're going to do with these examples is we're just going to go through and change them to where we have I and the negative. Okay? So we've got the square root of negative 121. We're going to change this to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 121. What's the square root of 121? What times what gives us 121? Anybody remember? 11. And then we can change the square root of negative 1 to what? I. Right? Just like we learned up here. Square root of negative 1 is I. So we have 11 imaginary. Yes, it's weird.
What I don't get is, so you took the negative out of the 121
Yep.
and you used that
Yeah.
as the negative 1.
Mm-hmm. And so I know the square root of negative 1 is just I. So I know I'm just going to put an I at the end.
Oh.
That's it.
Okay.
So you start off with
Yeah, taking out that negative 1. So we can do that for here too. We're going to take out that negative 1. And we have the square root of 28. What two numbers multiply to give us 28 were?
4.
7 and 4. Okay, so we have the square root of 7 times 4. What's the square root of 4?
Wait, what?
2. Okay, and what is the square root of negative 1? I. So we can bring that I all the way down. So we get 2I square root 7.
2I?
Mm-hmm.
Why I? That's the 2.
Well, it's the way it's written. We want it to be together. I don't know. It's just like a mathematical thing where it looks weird. And we don't want it after the square root sign because we want to know that I isn't under the square root. We're not taking the square root of I. All right. Now we're going to look at multiplication. What's 5 times 2? 10. And then we just leave the I at the end.
Oh, that was easy.
Okay. So here's it's a little bit harder. I'm waiting because I want to make sure people are caught up. I just did. I just took the numbers that have no i's and I multiplied them together. And then I put the I at the end. That's the whole thing.
So now we're doing negative 3 times 2 and that's
What's negative 3 times 2?
negative 6.
I times I is I. What does I squared stand for?
Negative 1.
So we go negative 6 times negative 1 is positive 6. So whoever music is playing, can we turn it off? So where did the negative 1 come from?
Because it's I.
I squared gives you negative 1. So we talked a little bit about that up here. I squared equals negative 1.
Okay, equals okay.
Okay. All right, a complex number is a combination of real numbers and imaginary numbers. We usually do that as, yeah, hold on, I gotta zoom out a little bit. We do that as A plus BI. So we're going to talk again about this stuff tomorrow. We're going to talk about adding and subtracting more tomorrow. A plus BI, real and imaginary. Okay. You can add and subtract complex numbers in the same way you have combined algebraic expressions. You keep your real terms and your imaginary terms apart, separate. Okay, so we're just going to do this addition and subtraction one right here. What's negative 2 plus 1? Negative 1. And what's 5 plus negative 7?
Negative 2.
So negative 1 minus 2i. That's the whole thing. Addition's really easy. You're literally being like, okay, these don't have any i's. I combine those. These have i's. I combine those. Okay. Let's look at the second one. Now, I got this minus sign on the outside. So remember, when I'm thinking about this, it's 4 minus a negative 1. So what's 4 minus a negative 1? 4 plus 1, right? So 4 plus 1 is 5. It's 4 minus a negative 1. Two negatives next to each other becomes a what, Abby? It's 4 minus a negative 1. Okay, now we're going to take, see this minus sign right here? Okay, good. 6i minus a positive 2i. Because I'm just combining terms. I'm just writing them separately.
So it's going to be 4.
I did these two. Now I'm going to do the i's. 6 minus 2 is 4. 4 what?
4i.
Plus 4i.
We in this board.
And don't worry, we're going to do way more addition and subtraction tomorrow, and you don't have homework with addition and subtraction on it tonight.
Is it again like division and multiplication?
Yes, but not until after we come back from break. Multiplication we might start because it's pretty easy, but division not until we come back from break. Okay, what's the square root of 64?
8.
Okay, now we have negative 49. So what's the square root of 49?
7.
7, right? Don't think about the negative. And then it has a negative there, so what do I need to have next to the 7? N what? I. Now, I'm going to back up and show all the work now. That's the shortcut, okay? The square root, we could have 8 plus, we know the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 49, right? This is what I did earlier. The square root of negative 1 is? I. So that's why I have that I and that 7. And then I just like them switched around because I feel like that looks weird. And I write 8 plus 7i.
Yeah.
You okay?
That makes sense how you did the first one.
Okay.
You should be square root of
Okay.
and then plus and there's the I.
All right. We're looking at I to the third. That means you have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is just negative 1, correct?
Yeah.
And then if we times that by the square root of negative 1, we have negative square root negative 1.
Okay, see that's, you lost me. So you got square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1. I was just getting negative 1 times square root of negative 1.
So this times this, okay, is negative 1, right? Because if we have the square root of negative 1 squared, remember just the squares go away. And then we're timesing it now. We've got negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 gives us negative square root negative 1. Or negative I. So what I want you to see right here, when I square something, it becomes negative 1. Okay? And we know the square root of negative I of negative 1 is just I. So we could have skipped right to here. Negative 1 times I is negative I. Should we do another one like that?
Yep.
Okay. Let's do I to the 5th. Okay? All right. So we know, can I simplify this into, I'm going to do as many pairs as possible. Okay? So I know I've got square root of negative 1 squared, and I've got square root of negative 1 squared, and then I've got 1 square root of negative 1 left over. We okay with that?
Yeah.
We've got, see, this is, I've got 2 of these, 4, 1 more makes 5. Okay? We know the square root of negative 1 squared gives me negative 1. I know the square root of negative 1 squared gives me negative 1. I know the square root of negative 1 just gives me I, because it's not being squared. Okay? What's a negative times a negative? So I'm just going to get I. 1 times I is I, right? We'll keep practicing those. Mm-hmm. You can. Okay. Number 3. Negative square root of negative 25. It's like the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Or we could just skip right to what? What's the square root of 25? It's got a negative in the inside, so what has to go next to my 5? I. Okay? All right. It's just like this. Right? So before we go too much further, the homework should be just like what we're doing. So real quick, let's do like 3 more and then we'll be done. What's the square root of negative 36? 6 what? Good.
6I.
Now 7 is I to the 7th power is a little confusing, right? Okay. So we've got the square root of negative 1 squared, square root of negative 1 squared, square root of negative 1 squared. And that means we have got to the 6th power, so we need 1 more, right? Okay. This is negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times I. What's a negative times a negative? Times a negative is a? So it's negative I, or negative 1I. So far, so good? So whenever you get them, you want to break them down into how many squareds you can get. Okay? And those, every time it's squared, it's negative 1. Whatever, if you have 1 left over, that becomes I. And then you're just going negative times negatives. That's it. We can try one more of those if you want. What's the square root of negative 121 again? 11 what? I. What's the square root of 144? What times what gives me 144? 12. But it's not negative, so no I, right? So it's 11I plus 12, and you're done.
That's it.
Yep. Let's do one more of those weird I things. We can do 2 more if we want. If you want to start working on your homework, that's fine. So we have I to the 4th. So that's the square root of negative 1 squared and the square root of negative 1 squared, right? Do we agree that squared and squared makes to the 4th? Okay. What's the square root of negative 1 squared? Negative 1, right? What's the square root of negative 1 squared? What's a negative times a negative? So the I to the 4th is just 1. Yeah, just keep that plus or minus there. So if it was like negative square root 16, negative 16, like that. So can you guys see that this is a negative right there? Okay. So we'd have negative, the square root, right? It would just be 4. It's got a negative in front of it, so I need a I. And then it's got a negative in front of the whole thing, so I just put a negative in front of it.
What about if it says plus or minus?
Then you have a plus and a minus.
So you just do 1 negative, 1 positive.
Others? Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording. Think you got most of this. We're gonna do more addition and subtraction tomorrow, and we might do multiplication on Friday.